lives, there is that demand of us. You could have seen the truth. You had the wherewithal to connect with the truth. Now what do you do? Lives, there is that demand of us. You could have seen the truth. You had the wherewithal to connect. I'm hearing myself in duplicate. Now what do you do? Lives.
Okay, go ahead.
What just happened?
It just you're streaming on YouTube now.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, you're right.
I was just thinking, wow, the voice sounds mighty familiar.
That's funny. Yeah, you're repeating yourself.
For a moment, I was thinking, is this a voice from above? I mean, I agreed with every word that was being spoken.
Oh, funny. Okay. Just give it just a couple more minutes.
Okay.
But that's true, what you said. I mean, just most of the time, your parents can tell when their kids are lying. And
I've been making this point repeatedly. This is what is simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying about living in the information age. All of the truth is right out there at our fingertips, and also all the lies. And that extraordinary democratization of information is terrifying about living. On the one hand, a great gift, and simultaneously, just on the other hand, but it's the same message. It is a prodigious responsibility, because in bygone eras, people may well really have been able to say in utmost earnestness, I didn't have any way of knowing any better. I got my information through the official channels. It's the only thing I could have gotten. And don't blame me if I got the wrong message. Not anymore. Now, anyone who embraces lies ultimately is doing it because he or she has chosen to embrace lies. Because the truth is there. And you have that inner mechanism, you can tell. You know if it's really a lie or not.
Yeah. Lost sound.
You lost my sound?
No, okay, now we did. Maybe you just took a long pause there.
Yes. Actually, I would like to share a source with you, if I may.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, let me just see. Do I have the ability to share screen? Let's see. Yes, I do. Okay. Okay. So we'll take this and I'll make it larger. I thought I'd make it larger. 1 second. I'll make it larger. There you go. Okay.
I'm going to check on it on YouTube to make sure all's good over there.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Looks like it. Yeah, anytime you're ready to start.
I'm sure. I'm ready.
Again. All right. Well, I just want to introduce Chaim Eisen to everyone in case you don't know who he is. He is a very, I would say, prolific speaker, an incredible teacher from Jerusalem, Yeshivat Sharashim, there in the land. And he's going to be talking to us today about Passover. The lessons in liberation and bondage, I believe, is kind of close to what the title is. And
Yes.
we look forward to hearing what you have to say, Chaim. So please carry on.
Thank you. And we'll see. The subjects I'd like to address inevitably lend themselves to a lot of other issues, including highly contemporary ones. as inevitably is always the case when we study the words of the Bible. So maybe we can have some time to consider those implications down the road. But first, to really plunge ourselves into Passover. And yeah, of course, inevitably, I always feel compelled to stress when we speak of one of the biblical feasts that most people describe them as Jewish holidays, and I'm surely not denying that they are definitely Jewish holidays, but they're biblical holidays. They're biblical holy days. And while unequivocally they obligate Israel, anyone who believes in the Bible inevitably seeks to extract from every single word of the Bible a salient message that impacts on our lives. And inevitably, then, these holy days are part of that. That is, these holy days are replete with messages that God is communicating to us through them. And inevitably, for anyone who believes in God's word in the Bible, that the Bible is God's will revealed in his word, then we have to seek to understand what God is revealing to us through these days. And of course, inevitably in that regard, when we begin to consider what Passover is about, maybe a good place to begin, and indeed one of the most strident enunciations of the message of Passover, is what we read here in Exodus chapter 13, verses 7 and 8. Unleavened bread, matzah, shall be eaten throughout the 7 days, and there shall no leavened bread be seen with you. Neither shall there be leaven seen with you in all of your borders. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, it is because of that which the Lord did for me when I went forth out of Egypt. There are a number of motifs here, obviously. Of course, there is the motif of communicating to the children. We're going to get back to that, God willing. And of course, there is the unleavened bread, the matzah, which plays such a central role in our observance of Passover. And simultaneously, perhaps most crucially, the message that this is a commemoration of our going forth from Egypt. That message of the Exodus is because of that which the Lord did for me when I went forth out of Egypt. And of course, inevitably, I must note here, there is a critical dimension that may strike us as odd when one considers, as inevitably we must, what the practical implications of this statement are. Namely, to this very day, we're still saying, this is what God did for me when I went forth from Egypt. Now, I personally was never in Egypt. I imagine probably most of you haven't been either. So what exactly is meant by the Lord did for me when I went forth out of Egypt? And of course, inevitably, it's critical for us to appreciate that the implications of this statement are, I don't regard what's described in the Bible as something that happened way back in the past. It is something that's impacting on my life right now, in the present. So even if I, in any literal sense, did not go forth from Egypt, I'm communicating this message. I must note, as you may be aware, that there are many communities that adopted the practice on the Seder night of actually going through some dramatic reliving of the Exodus, replete with costumes and the whole outfit. But this idea that this is not something that merely is relegated to the past, but it is a presence, is certainly an essential component. And inevitably, we also appreciate that it informs many statements that we encounter really throughout the Torah, particularly in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 5, you shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy chapter 15, you shall remember that you were a bondman, a servant in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 16, again, you shall remember that you were a bondman, servant in Egypt. And likewise, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, once again, the same thing. You shall remember, you were a bondman, you were a servant in Egypt. Once again, verse 18, verse 22, this theme of you are part of it, this is happening to you. And of course, to that extent, we appreciate that there is something of an emergent tension here between focusing on you were a bondman, you were a slave, and focusing upon the liberation. And in some sense, we could argue that this idea is manifest in distinct motifs that we see stressed in God's words in Exodus chapter 12, in verse 8, the prescription, you might even say the recipe for the first Seder night, eating the meat of the Paschal offering with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. So the theme of the Paschal offering will be returning to consider in another few minutes. Clearly, it's going to be a theme of liberation. You eat it with the unleavened bread. We'll consider shortly what the message of the unleavened bread is, and bitter herbs. Bitter herbs, we get the sense from the way we refer to them. Bitter, and that comes from the Hebrew. Merorim, mar means bitter. Aren't ostensibly an invocation of the Exodus, but rather of the bondage. You cannot focus only on your having gone forth from bondage. You need also to focus on the bondage itself. We see this also expressed in Numbers chapter 9, which is the description of the celebration of Passover that takes place a year later in the wilderness. And there is the particular problem of those individuals who are in a state of defilement and they aren't able to bring the Paschal offering in its proper time. And God reveals through them the idea of a second Passover, which I like to describe as the holiday of second chances, where you would celebrate Passover a month later, and you do so with the same motifs that pertain to Passover itself. And again, the emphasis, you bring the Paschal offering and you eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, because you can't do it without these two very divergent, so we would think, these two very divergent motifs. They both need to be there. But now, when we consider what the message of the unleavened bread is, which of course is so central to everything that we've seen, there is a tantalizing ambiguity. One might even argue a kind of apparent contradiction. Not really a contradiction, but certainly a tension. In Exodus chapter 12, we read, and this is a description of how Israel is going forth from Egypt. They baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they brought forth out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victual. So to that extent, then, the role of the matzah, the unleavened bread, is a symbol of how they were thrust out of Egypt suddenly without any time to tarry, and the matzah then, in effect, becomes the bread of liberation. And yet, simultaneously, in Deuteronomy chapter 16, where we read of the cycle of the holy days, there is a reiteration of the cycle of the holy days, twice in Exodus, once in Leviticus, once in Numbers, and once in Deuteronomy. This is the last reiteration of the cycle of the holy days in the 5 books of Moses. And when we read about the Passover, verse 2, you shall sacrifice the Passover offering unto the Lord your God. Verse 3, you shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread therewith. And how is the unleavened bread described here? The bread of affliction. The bread of affliction. But I thought the message that we got from Exodus chapter 12 was that it was in effect the bread of liberation, because there wasn't any time for it to rise. Now, that theme does reappear immediately afterward. For in haste, you did go forth out of the land of Egypt. But still, the manner in which it is initially portrayed in Deuteronomy chapter 16 is not this blood of revelation, but rather the blood of affliction. And inevitably, on some plane, that carries with it the implication that there is a more complex message that we need to integrate from what Passover is coming to convey. By which I mean, I think usually think of Passover as a commemoration of liberation. And on some level, of course, inevitably, when one considers the message with respect to the Paschal offering in Exodus chapter 12, this is an inescapable conclusion. That is, in verse 26, when your children ask, what do you mean by this service? The answer is, it is a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover offering. For that, he passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. So the Paschal offering is clearly coming to enunciate this theme of liberation. And yet, you don't have it in a manner that will only remind you of liberation. First of all, you have it with bitter herbs. And it's sure hard to envision the bitter herbs as anything other than an enunciation of the bitterness of bondage. And furthermore, inevitably we appreciate that at this point, we understand the matzah itself has these two mixed motifs. That on the one hand, the matzah, the unleavened bread, is the bread of affliction, and it's also the bread of liberation, which I think perhaps more than anything else drives home to us the awareness that Passover needs to be a commemoration not only of liberation, but also of bondage. And as a result, we stress both themes. We stress the identity of the unleavened bread as bread of affliction, not only as bread of liberation. We consume the bitter herbs. The truth of the matter is, I don't want to overplay this because this inevitably pertains to many additional strata, motifs that are not explicit in the Bible, but are definitely central in our tradition. That is, just as a couple of sundry illustrations of which undoubtedly all of you who have experienced the Passover Seder are well aware. On the one hand, the cups of wine are a remembrance of liberation. The affluence of drinking 4 cups of wine, perhaps in some way, a little bit indicative of the notion of a symposium that we find in Greek culture, except of course dedicated to God rather than to all sorts of other agendas. And simultaneously, and this is the sort of thing, if this group would not be the sort of group that it is, I would have to be a little bit circumspect in sharing this. But the idea that there is a preference specifically for red wine as a remembrance of the blood of the Israelite children that was shed. So of course, no, you know very well that the libel, the blood libel of blood being used in matzah or in any other aspect of the Passover was among the most malicious and completely unconscionable lies that were perpetrated against the Jews over the course of the exile. But there is this idea of suffering that needs to be commemorated. And another example that inevitably comes to mind, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the charoset. The charoset, in which we have the practice of dipping the bitter herbs that we read explicitly, of course, are to be consumed with the Paschal offering. And the identity of the charoset, more than anything else, is a remembrance of the mortar, because the slaves were preoccupied in making bricks and mortar in order to build the storehouses that the Egyptians demanded of the slaves to construct. And yet simultaneously, almost ubiquitously, the practice is that the charoset is not evocative in and of itself of bitterness. On the contrary, we make it out of sweet ingredients that are associated with either the types of fruit that in one way or another are intimated in the Song of Songs, which is read in many ways as a song that serves as a parable for the Exodus, or other ways of exemplifying our relationship with God. So is it bitterness or is it sweetness? Is it the mortar or is it the close relationship with God? And of course, this is just another example. It's both. We have all of these fascinating mixed motifs that are endemic in our observance of Passover, which again is not just a commemoration of the passing over, God passing over and smiting the Egyptians and saving Israel, because that would just be a remembrance of the Exodus. And it's not just a remembrance of the Exodus. It's also a remembrance of the bondage that came before. And that in itself, of course, inevitably demands of us to ask, why? Why do we have to remember the bad stuff? Can't we just remember the good stuff? I'm sure there are a lot of people who on manifold planes would be very inclined to that alternative of just remembering the good and forgetting about the bad. And again, I stress, this is something that doesn't merely reflect our personal observances. We see this endemic in the observance of the Passover offering. You have the matzah, which in itself, of course, is a split motif because it's the bread of affliction, the bread of liberation, and you have the bitter herbs. And you can't do it without all of these motifs swirling in front of you when you're observing the Passover as God commands it. Why? So, of course, on the one hand, we could reflect on the simple, straightforward reality that if we want to be honest, we have to remember both sides of the coin. That's both part of history. And of course, that's true. And on some level, I'm going to consider that to be our first answer to this question. I'd like to share with you at least four. And I don't regard these answers as alternatives, but rather more on the level of incremental building. Because on some level, the first answer, saying, well, that's life, that was history, may be true, but it's certainly woefully inadequate. Maybe most importantly, because we're not historians. The Bible is not a book of history. Even when it tells us about historical events, it's still not a book of history. Torah, as we've noted on many occasions, one of the most frequently mistranslated words in Hebrew, does not mean law, it means teaching. Teaching us about life. History may be part of that, but it certainly is not the goal. The Torah doesn't come to teach us history. Ultimately, it comes to engender in us a relationship with God. And so inevitably on that plane, we'll say, second level. Second level isn't merely recognizing that the historical continuum involved the bondage and the Exodus, that on some level we appreciate the Exodus as coming in the wake of the bondage. And we would be utterly incapable of being able to establish that bond with God through the Exodus if there weren't the cognizance of the bondage that came before. Now, this is a principle that on some level, I'll say automatically parlays into, I'm not going to describe this as level 3, I'll rather describe it as level 2B. This is a level that everyone who is either a parent or a teacher can very well appreciate. And that is, if you're trying to convey something to your children, to your students, if you don't give them a sense of the problem, then whatever solution you have to offer will be useless, meaningless. It's precisely by recognizing that there is something that needs to be addressed, that needs to be overcome, that the answer becomes significant. And I note this point in particular with respect to the observance of Passover, because of a crucial theme that we see reiterated over and over again in what the Bible tells us with respect to what takes place when we commemorate Passover. And that is, well, I've emphasized this with the stress on b'neichem, your children. And of course, it's not only in Exodus chapter 12 that we see this emphasis upon the children. We see it again in Exodus chapter 13, verse 8. You tell your son, when your son asks you, what is this? Culminating ultimately in the son who asks all the questions in Deuteronomy chapter 6, when your son asks you in time to come, what mean the testimonies, the statutes, the ordinances, which the Lord our God has commanded you. And that focus upon asking questions is of such central, even overriding significance. Anyone who has been present at a Passover Seder, of course, knows very well the central role of the youngest present, the star of the ceremony in getting up until at least a certain age. We always had the child standing on the chair. At some point, the child gets high enough that could be a little bit destabilizing, but nonetheless, to sing the questions. And while the questions that are part of, I'll even say, the liturgy of the Passover Seder are obviously a linchpin in all the proceedings, if you've been to a traditional Seder, you know the questions don't end there. On the contrary, we're looking forward to our Passover Seder. We have a number of guests coming, and they already know the premium is on asking good questions, all about questions. We usually conclude the proceedings someplace generally between 2 and 4 in the morning, depending on how many good questions there are, because there are a lot of questions to discuss. And it's that very process of questions and answers that becomes central, because again, ultimately, you can never appreciate an answer if you don't appreciate the question that underlies it. That's critical in life. And again, I reiterate, this is as the second layer in our progression is precisely in this realization that in order to come to this sense of what is being engendered here in our relationship with God, we'll only be able to appreciate the Exodus if we appreciate the bondage as well. Now, this in itself, I'll say, feeds into level number 3, where level number 3, this is an idea that I believe we have discussed in other contexts as well, is realizing that the interplay between the problem that comes first and the resolution that follows isn't something that only applies to Passover, and it's not only something that applies to a good teaching technique. It is endemic in the world. Perhaps best exemplified in that recurrent theme that we encounter over and over again on all of the 6 days of God's creation prior to the heavenly Sabbath. And that is that theme: there was evening and there was morning, 1 day, 2 days, and so on and so forth. Except, of course, the Bible doesn't say evening or morning. Indeed, those words never appear in the Bible because the Bible wasn't written in English. The Hebrew is Vahi Erev, Vahi Voker. Those words do translate to evening and morning. But the difference between just using the English words and using the Hebrew words is when you use the Hebrew, you appreciate that in biblical Hebrew, you always need to look for the three-letter root. The three-letter root of Erev, meaning evening, is mixture. Of course, on some level, just optically, when evening comes, images get mixed together. You can't see clearly anymore. In contrast, Boker comes with a three-letter root that means to discern. Discernment is bikoret. And once again, we appreciate optically what that means in the most basic sense of, well, when morning comes, that murkiness, that mixture resolves itself into distinct images and you're able to see clearly again. But consider what the deeper implications are in understanding what's taking place in the Torah story of creation. In the Torah story of creation, ironically, is not the central theme. The verb create appears only in 3 verses in the whole narrative. In the first verse, the 21st verse, and the 27th verse. What exactly is the significance of those 3? It's an interesting question, but I think we'll put it on the side. Maybe look forward to having a discussion of Genesis chapter 1 in some other context. But what is the central theme of Genesis chapter 1 if it's not creation? Simply this: differentiation, ordering. You have this calamitous confusion, and it becomes resolved into order. And that really is the nature of life itself. So inevitably, when we consider what life signifies in this vein, we appreciate that it's not just in the case of the Exodus that you need to consider that grim, chaotic disorder as the precedent to and prerequisite of the resolution that follows. You need to see all of life in these terms. And again, it is unequivocally in that sense that we appreciate this message as something that's going to inform our understanding of life itself. Perhaps an outstanding illustration, what we read in Psalm 92. Psalm 92 is the song of the Sabbath day, which I'll just note has nothing at all to do with the 7th day of the week, but everything to do with the idea of a Sabbath as a culmination of life in this world. And it's in this vein that we consider the implications of verse 3. After stating, it is good to give thanks unto the Lord and to sing praises unto your name, O Most High, there's the distinction: to declare your loving kindness in the morning and your faithfulness in the nights. As if to say that all of life can be resolved into 2 different realms. There are the mornings and there are the nights. In the morning, we can declare God's loving kindness because we experience it. It's there, present, palpable. That's part of life. But there's another part of life, likened to the night, when everything is dark, gloomy, and confusing. And I can't declare God's kindnesses because I'm not experiencing them. And at those moments, I'm sustained by faith. And inevitably, we appreciate there would be something ruinously missing if the commemoration of Passover were only a commemoration of the Exodus. Because then we might indeed get a strong, powerful message about declaring God's loving kindness when it's morning outside. But it wouldn't tell us one thing at all about how to be sustained through the dark night. When you see how one is connected with the other, that there is indeed a progression from the night to the morning, as exemplified in the first chapter of Genesis, and again, on some level, exemplified by the Exodus, following on the heels of bondage. That gives you the wherewithal to be able to recount God's faithfulness during the nights. And carrying this one step further brings us to level number 4. Level number 4, in a way, the inevitable corollary of what we just said, is realizing, it's not there was bondage and then there was an exodus, or evening and morning as two separate and distinct realms, because they both share one author. They both come from God. And that necessarily informs our understanding of both stages. We may have mentioned this at some point in the past, but it's just so germane that I feel compelled to stress it now, irrespective of whether we have or we haven't. And that is when we consider what takes place in Exodus chapter 5. Exodus chapter 5, after Moses has come before Pharaoh, demanding that Israel be allowed to go and serve God. And of course, it would be a profound misstatement to make to say that Moses coming before Pharaoh doesn't accomplish anything. Oh boy, does he accomplish something. The situation gets precipitously worse. As we read from verse 6 and on, the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, "You shall no more give the people straw to make brick as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. And the tally of the bricks which they did make heretofore, you shall lay upon them. You shall not diminish any of it. Let heavier work be laid upon the men, that they may labor therein, and let them not regard lying words." What unspeakable suffering. The torment was so great until now, and it just got that much greater. And the consequence, of course, as we read in the verses that follow, the taskmasters, let this be known to the people. Pharaoh says, "I will not give you straw." And in verse 12, we read, the people were scattered abroad throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. And the flesh and blood eyes, we just see unconscionable, gratuitous torment without purpose. So overwhelming, so incomprehensible that Moses himself is dispirited. When the officers of the children of Israel were beaten because they weren't able to deliver the tally of bricks, they meet Moses and Aaron, and they say to them, "The Lord look upon you and judge, because you have made our Savior to be abhorred in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to slay us. What have you done?" And Moses returned to the Lord and say, "Lord, why have you dealt so badly with this people? Why did you send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has dealt badly with his people, and you haven't delivered them at all." And the next verse, which in the common division is at the beginning of chapter 6, but it's the next verse. God says to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh, for by a strong hand shall he let them go, and by a strong hand shall he drive them out of his land." What's going on? So we have an ancient tradition that indeed, when God sent Moses to Pharaoh, it was time to roll out the plagues of Egypt in all of their devastating ferocity, except God, as it were, had a problem. The problem that when the plagues begin smiting the Egyptians, the rank and file Egyptians will say, "Pharaoh sinned. Why are we suffering? It's not fair." And that objection that it isn't fair was enough to halt the plagues in their tracks, because God is God of justice. And if there is this incipient potential complaint that it isn't fair, then how can God begin the plagues? So what happens? Moses comes before Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, "That's it. No straw." Okay, no straw. It's a problem. But going back to chapter 5, verse 12, so the people were scattered abroad throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. What's such a big deal in finding stubble for straw? After the harvest, what's left in the fields is straw. No one needs it. No one wants it. It's useless. Garbage. So just gather that stubble from the fields. Why do you have to scatter abroad throughout all the land of Egypt? Because when one of the slaves would go into a field to gather the stubble for straw, the owner of the field, the Egyptian, would come after him with sticks and chase him out of his field. Don't take anything from my field, even though he didn't have any reason to want the stubble for himself. Just to be tormenting. That extra gratuitous suffering. You won't take stubble from my field. And again, to flesh and blood eyes, just extra suffering. To God's eyes, remember what was holding back the plagues? That the rank and file Egyptians would be able to complain, it's not fair? Not anymore. Now you're all guilty. Now you're all culpable. Now indeed, the plagues will be unleashed in all of their ferocity and terror. So, no stubble for straw. Is that part of the bondage or is that part of the Exodus? Not so simple. It depends on how you look at it. If you look at it through mere mortal eyes, you see suffering. If you are gifted to see more deeply, you see that's part of the Exodus itself. And of course, inevitably, it must be so. Because after all, it isn't like there's some kind of dualistic source in which the bad comes from one source and the good, God forbid, everything comes from God. So the source of the bondage and the source of the liberation inevitably is one. Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. For by a strong hand shall I let them go, and by a strong hand he shall drive him out of his land. Necessarily, everything is connected. Perhaps in a similar vein, with respect to the redemption of the future, we read in Jeremiah chapter 31, "Hear the word of the Lord, O you nations, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, he that scattered Israel does gather him, and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. The same one who scattered is the one who gathers the flock once more." And perhaps precisely in this vein, in verse 12, we read, "Then shall the virgin rejoice in the dance, and the young man and old together, for I will turn their mourning into joy, and will comfort them, and make them rejoice." The translation reads here, "make them rejoice from their sorrow," but we could also translate mi yigonam, the prefix mem for the Hebrew experts, could also mean through, because of their sorrow. And I said, well, it's exactly the same thing. That is the realization that it isn't merely there was sorrow and now there was rejoicing. No. The rejoicing and the sorrow are inextricably linked. They both come from the same divine source. And you haven't begun to appreciate that divine source if you see it only as the source of the rejoicing and not as the source of the sorrow. They're both together there, inseparable. I remember a number of years ago, I heard true story. A young man who was a biker in the mountains, I think it was in the Rockies. And as he's rounding the bend, he sees an 18-wheeler bearing right down on him. And there's no place to turn. There's the face of the mountain on one side, and there's a bare cliff on the other. And in the seconds before the inevitable impact, for the first time in his life, he turns to God. God, if you get me out of this, I'm yours. He was, for a good many months, in the hospital, recuperating from his wounds, but he actually did get out of it. And he remembered his promise. The story began in the Rockies, ended here in Jerusalem. He came to Jerusalem and presented himself to the headmaster of a seminary that is, to this day, very specifically geared for people coming from a background that's completely estranged from God, to introduce them to faithfulness. And he tells the headmaster his story. He says, that's why I'm here. And the headmaster responds, well, welcome, but before you come in, I just need to point out one little detail. The same God who saved you also sent the 18-wheeler. Takes guts to say that, doesn't it? But is there any other source? Of course, it's the same God who sent the 18-wheeler. And of course, implicit in the statement is, I don't want you to be coming here on the presupposition that God is just there as your cosmic teddy bear who's going to get you out of all problematic circumstances that come from someplace else. All those problems also come from him. And establishing a relationship with God means establishing a relationship through them both. If the relationship to God is based only on the Exodus and not on bondage, then something fundamentally is flawed in your relationship. And of course, this is something that we see critically enunciated in Isaiah chapter 45. We ask the question, so who is the source of evil? This is a question that may make us squirm, but God gives you an unambiguously answer. In verse 7, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I am the Lord that does all these things. Could it be otherwise? We aren't dualists. There can only be one source. Everything comes from God. Now, I always feel compelled to note, I'll try and do this briefly, and I hope without complicating matters too much. But what exactly does that mean, that God creates evil? And I feel compelled to share the insight of one of the great classic medieval scholars, Rabbi Moses Maimonides, in first noting a glaring problem in understanding what the verse means, the use of the word create, as in, I form the light and create darkness. How do you create darkness? Darkness isn't the presence, darkness is an absence. So what does it mean to create darkness? And what he notes is the verb that we are translating as create, boré, is precisely that verb that we encounter in Genesis chapter 1 in verses 1, 21, and 27. And carries the connotation, according to many scholars, of creation ex nihilo, creating from nothing, absolute nothingness. Obviously, in the opening verse of Genesis chapter 1, God is creating from nothing. And Rabbi Moses Maimonides proposes, in Hebrew, we associate this verb, bara, boré, with nothingness, because in Genesis chapter 1, it carries the connotation of creating from nothing. Well, in Isaiah chapter 45, it carries the connotation of creating a nothing. Because darkness isn't a something, darkness is a nothing. So what's the meaning of I form light and create darkness? Simply this. I form light, but concomitant with that, I establish the potentiality for that light being withdrawn. And that's tantamount to creating darkness, the potentiality for the light being taken away. And in precisely the same vein, the continuation of the verse, I make peace and create evil. Evil is also not a presence, it's an absence. Evil always is deficiency. God creates a world in which there is the potential for deficiency. God doesn't actualize that potential. Who actualizes that potential? We do. Where's the first place that evil appears in the Bible? The tree of knowing good and evil. God makes the tree, but it only becomes actualized evil when Adam and Eve choose to eat of it. But what is most directly germane for our purposes is simply this realization. Everything has its source in God. The good and the evil. The bondage, just as the Exodus. And of course, this theme of recognizing that God is the source is one that we find expressed elsewhere in the Bible as well. Just noting very briefly, Amos chapter 3, verse 6, shall evil befall a city and the Lord has not done it? In Lamentations chapter 3, likewise, asking rhetorically, who is he that says, and it comes to pass when the Lord commands it not, out of the mouth of the Most High proceed not evil and good? Everything comes from God. Everything comes from God, and therefore recognizing that not only the Exodus, but also the bondage are gifts from God is essential if we're going to get our lessons correct. What does it mean in practice? Well, we'll just note as a case in point. In what context is the bondage in Egypt first enunciated? Of course, in the covenant of the halves, in Genesis chapter 15. That God says to Abram, know of a surety that your seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they shall come out with great substance. What's the great substance? The gold and silver? That's not great substance. What's the great substance? The great substance is they come out of bondage in Egypt and they receive God's word. They receive the Torah. They experience the theophany at Sinai. So they only get there through having gone through this process and everything that it entails, including all the negative, not just the positive. There is perhaps an even more essential message to appreciate in this vein, and that is that there is an almost ubiquitous perception that the theme of what Moses is soliciting from Pharaoh is let my people go. And I admit that I leave the translation here as stated, which is let my people go, but I must admit it's a really awful translation. First of all, it's never let my people go. It is always let my son go that he may serve me. Let my people go that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. Let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. Always with a goal, a spiritual goal. The Exodus isn't supposed to be some wholesale liberation. It is rather means to that end. And indeed, I'll add further that I don't think let my people go is even an apt translation, because the Hebrew is always ubiquitously shalach et ami. And as all the Hebrew experts can undoubtedly testify, shalach means send forth, as in send forth on a mission. So rather than let my people go, I would render it as send my people forth to serve me. Everything that had experienced in bondage, ultimately, is means to that end. And if you don't get to that final goal, that realization, which is inextricably linked to the bondage, you haven't gotten the message. So if we ask ourselves in practice, how does this work? That is, how can the bondage and liberation represent two sides of one coin? So, of course, inevitably, one dimension that I feel compelled to stress in returning to something that we discussed a while back in this progression is indeed the realization that matzah has these two seemingly contradictory themes. Is matzah the bread of affliction or is it the bread of liberation? And there are a number of answers with respect to the implicit tension between these two identifications of the matzah. One proposition is, well, matzah, if I may put it in these terms, sticks on the ribs. It has staying power. So it was the bread that the Egyptians fed their slaves because it would keep them full and able to keep on working. And the self-same matzah then becomes the bread of liberation. And they have no time to tarry for the dough to rise. Perhaps even more aptly in that regard, we can consider another interpretation, which is, well, in as much as slaves have no control over their time, slaves would eat their bread as matzah because it was something they could produce quickly. And that haste then is, in the case of bondage, an expression of their suffering. And the self-same haste becomes the haste of liberation because God has redeemed them so suddenly, so swiftly. Either way, to appreciate that there is this inseparable connection between bondage and liberation. The theme of let my people go that they may serve me is something that appears over and over again throughout the plagues. And we can certainly appreciate what that message then would signify in terms of what we've seen. But there is perhaps an even deeper message, maybe even the deepest message, when we consider the connection between the bondage and liberation. And if I may share with you in this regard, an approach that is enunciated by Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Cook, who served as the chief rabbi for the first part of the British Mandate here in the land of Israel in the first part of the 20th century, a century ago. You haven't really appreciated the connection between bondage and liberation until you truly see them as inseparable. Of course, on the one hand, bondage is a crippling state physically and mentally and spiritually. And certainly the burden of bondage is one that weighs so heavily upon both body and soul. But at the same time, what do you learn from bondage? To subordinate yourself to something greater than you are. And what does it take to accept upon ourselves the mission that God gives us at Sinai? Precisely that. So, in its own way, then, we appreciate that the message of let my people go that they may serve me is one that is actualizable exclusively because they were in bondage. They learned the lesson. Now they know to integrate that into their lives up ahead. And that's just so critically important. And of course, the real take home from all of this, extending far beyond the parameters of bondage and liberation, as expressed so aptly in Micah chapter 7, verse 8. Rejoice not against me, O my enemy. When I am fallen, I am arisen. When I sit in darkness, the Lord is a light unto me. And I'm deliberately translating when, because that's what the text says. It's not though. Though implies, well, though I am fallen, I will nonetheless rise. It's not though. On the contrary, it is precisely through falling that the rising comes. Through sitting in darkness that God is my light. We have an ancient tradition on this verse conveying precisely this message. If I would not have fallen, I would not have arisen. If I would not have sat in darkness, God would not have been my light. In a similar vein, when we read in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 16, a righteous man stumbles, falls 7 times and rises up again. But the wicked stumble in evil. So one of the great scholars of a generation ago, Rabbi Isaac Kutner, commented on this verse that superficial fools think the verse is saying, even though the righteous falls, nonetheless he rises. The righteous are those who have the fortitude, the perseverance, the dedication to transform every fall into a rise. We all fall down. Question is, what happens next? The wicked stumble in their evil, and they just remain there on the ground. The righteous, again, have the fortitude and perseverance to transform every fall into another rising. And of course, we're not speaking of stumbling, falling, merely in a physical sense of stubbing one's toe. The spiritual fall. That every one who is righteous inexorably experiences even relentlessly in life. But what are you going to do about it next? Is that going to be the end? Or do I see in the fall precisely the seeds of the rising up? That precisely because I am fallen, I am arisen. Because I am sitting in darkness, God is my light. Because of the bondage, I experience the exodus. Because the same author who is giving me the bondage gives me the exodus. It can be no other way. And it's in that vein that I'd like to conclude with an insight. I think we may have discussed this previously as well, but it's just so profoundly germane that I feel I need to share it right now. There is an expression that we find 3 times in the Bible. That is, we find this self-same expression. Isaiah chapter 12 is the song of the redemption of the future. But the formulation that we find in the second half of Isaiah chapter 12, verse 2, is a formulation that we encounter also in the song of the first redemption, the redemption from Egypt. That is the song that was sung by Moses and Israel at the banks of the Red Sea. And indeed, in Exodus chapter 15, verse 2, we encounter precisely the self-same formulation that is the formulation that we encounter in the Song of Redemption of the Future in Isaiah chapter 12, verse 2. And we encounter the exact same formulation likewise in Psalm 118, verse 14. And admittedly, there are questions with respect to how properly to render this in translation. I'm going to focus upon Isaiah chapter 12 because there's a particular message, not just in verse 2, but in verse 1. And you can see I modified the conventional translation. No, it's not. I will give thanks unto you because though you were angry with me, your anger is turned away. No, that's not what the verse is saying. There's no though here. In the Hebrew, Odecha Hashem, I will give thanks to you, O Lord. Ki anaftabi, because you were angry with me. Yashov apechal denachameni, which either is a statement, when your anger is turned away, you comfort me, or prayer, may your anger be turned away, may you comfort me. But that first part, I repeat, critically, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, because you were angry with me. Because I felt smitten by you. I will give thanks because ultimately I come to the understanding that that was part of the picture, but not the whole picture. And that smiting is part of what leads to the comforting when your anger is turned away. And they are indeed inseparable. We have in our tradition an illustration associated with verse 1 of the man who was going to set sail on a really, really important trip, and he gets a thorn in his foot and he misses the boat, and he's on the verge of blaspheming. He's so angry at God. Why did you do this to me? And of course, then he hears the ship went down at sea with all hands on board. And of course, I realize we feel a kind of knee-jerk necessity of saying, yeah, but it doesn't really happen that way in life. And indeed, it may happen only rarely that we're able to see how everything works out in a period of just a few weeks. It could take years, it could take centuries, lifetimes. We don't have the breadth of vision to be able to perceive it. But yes, we do indeed affirm that everything is part of this huge continuum. And it's precisely because of that that you get to verse 2. Behold the God of my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. The trust comes because I didn't only experience God in those sunny moments of bright morning. Were that the case, then the moment that I would see the dark gloom of the night, I'd be terrified. Now, I already know God is with me in the gloom as well. And that leads me to the end of verse 2, which I render as not God is my strength and my song. That the strength and pruning of the Lord is become my salvation. This is a longer story. If people are interested, we can discuss on what basis we translate zimrat as pruning. Indeed, that three-letter root does mean pruning. It also means song. It means pruning. And I submit that what the prophet is telling us, but in each of these three instances, this idea of the strength and pruning of the Lord has become my salvation. The moment of salvation is when I have the wherewithal to be able to look at all of my suffering and say, oh Lord, I thought you were cutting me. Now I realize you were pruning me. Pruning is a profoundly traumatic process. I never interviewed a tree, but it's cutting off living branches. So it's got to be traumatic. But you know that it's precisely because of the pruning that the tree will be that much more productive. So that redemptive moment is, I thought you were cutting, but you were pruning. And God is the God of my salvation, in whom I trust. because he gives me both the bondage and the exodus. And I celebrate them both every year. On Passover, and through Passover, hope, every day of the year. God bless you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I have a couple of things I'd like to ask you, and I'm sure maybe some others might have a few questions or comments. But I was reminded to go to Isaiah 26, and in verse 9, it says, "With my soul I desired thee in the night. With my spirit within me will I seek thee early." And it says, "For when thy judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness." And so I see what you're saying here, that when the
Absolutely.
distress and judgments come upon us, we learn. In fact, righteousness is what comes from us. It comes through us. It comes out of us. So that scripture came to me. And then as I went down to verse 16, and I this goes along with it. It says, "Lord, in trouble have they visited thee. They poured out a prayer when thy chastening was upon them." And I believe it's talking about the nation of Israel. So again, lines up with what you're talking about. Do you have
Absolutely.
anything to say about that?
I completely agree with you. That is, that indeed, this process is one that would woefully lack depth if it did not include the chastening that comes from the suffering.
Well,
And
then,
on some plane, we aren't really recognizing God as king over our lives if we're only singing about the good and not about the bad.
Mhm.
God is king over our lives with respect to everything.
Yeah, it makes us better. It makes us, introspective. It makes us, think about things instead of just living a life on that's, surface and maybe self-oriented. We tend to dig deep and look at the inner parts of our being, I believe. Would you think that this idea of bitterness and liberation applies to the contemporary times of war that we're in,
Oh boy, and how?
as it relates to God?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we've been on this extraordinarily terrifying, but extraordinary roller coaster for the last 2.5 years, and I definitely see that as part of the process that we need to go through. That is, at this point, I think anyone with eyes in his head can appreciate that what is taking place over the course of these 2.5 years is really an extraordinarily terrifying at times, but an extraordinary outpouring of God's love. But love sometimes also hurts. It's tough love, and we experience that as well.
I agree.
I must share with you on a personal plane. There's I mentioned the story of that seminary that caters to people coming from non-committed backgrounds, and there's another seminary completely unassociated with the other one, but a couple of blocks down the way on our street, and we typically have over students for Shabbat meals from this seminary, and I found it extraordinary that there is a significant, shall we say, uptick of students who have come to God specifically because of the circumstances of this war. And that's not even reflecting on what's taking place here in Israel, where anywhere between a third to a half of the country say their relationship with God has been deepened because of this war. So as a basis for contrast, I know there was an extraordinary renaissance in faith that followed the 6-Day War, but that was a very different renaissance because then everything was going beautifully. See extraordinary miracles being manifested in the world. here there's a lot of suffering, so many tears, so many calamitous events. But that in itself, maybe similar to the story about the biker, that becomes the basis for a much more sublime relationship with God than one could have possibly had without that. So yes, I definitely feel that's something that's taking place here.
I heard that after October 7th, so many young people came back to Torah and came back to faith
Absolutely right.
in Israel.
100%. I mean, I think it was most vividly spearheaded by the soldiers themselves, and simultaneously, it really has engulfed the nation. There has been a tremendous reawakening.
Yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and open this up now to anybody who would have a question or a comment.
Maybe I should stop the screen share just so people
Yeah,
can
that'd be
see
great.
it.
Sure.
Wait, how do I do this again? Just 1 second.
Go ahead, anybody? Don't be shy.
Well, Vicky, can I say something here then?
Of course. Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, Chaim, thank you for the lesson today. This is really, really good. I got a lot of notes on what you were talking about, and half of them aren't even what you were saying. It was what I was seeing as the symbolism, and that's the beauty of God's word. It just kind of comes alive. I need you to do one thing for me, if you could. I'm going to make a statement about something, and I want to, and then you can correct me, okay? But when when the people were instructed to go and gather stubble, this what you described as the useless waste of the land, just and then people would get driven out of there, get out of here, get off my land, and everything. I saw a YouTube video. This was like, a couple of years ago or so. And it was about brick making. And I always had this thing in my head since I was a kid. What would they need? What would they need hay and stubble for, to making brick? And the video literally was not that they would put the hay the stubble in the straw in the in the mortar and the mixture, but they would use it to burn so that it would be the fire to cook the brick, to make it so that the brick would go through the fire to be useful later on. And so when you mention that, they got me to thinking about that. And I think it's in Zechariah. I might not be right about that, but it says a third shall come through the fire and be purified. And I think this goes along with your theme about you go through the fire, but then it's something valuable comes out of it in the end. And so that the stubble aspect where it gets burned and that's its purpose is to achieve something greater. Am I close on that?
Oh, turn your mic on. Turn your mic on, Rabbi.
Okay,
there you
sorry.
go.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you.
Mhm.
No, I must share with you, our youngest son studied aerospace engineering at the Technion, Israel's Institute of Technology. And I remember his telling me that when he took a course in composites, the professor presented as the first template for a composite material the bricks in Egypt, where the way the professor understood it was, yes, there was the clay and there was the straw that was the interleaved substance to hold it all together. So I'm not so sure about the only role of the stubble being to burn it, but the idea, I certainly agree. There's that even if it is a matter of you come through the fire, and that's the manner in which you emerge in your connectedness with God, then unequivocally that makes it something of value. Obviously, when I said this, the stubble is of no consequence, I was simply referring to its uselessness for the Egyptian landowners.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
God
Thanks,
bless you.
Benny. Anybody else? Jackie, I noticed your mic is off. Did you have anything to say? Or rather, it's on. Guess not. Okay. You guys are very quiet today and absent. I can't even see your faces. So anyway.
Right. If people are interested, I can continue with, on the
Comes
theme of.
Paul. Looks like Paul's going to say
Oh,
something.
please go for it. Great.
So thank you, Rabbi, for this lesson today. It's profound in that, we all go through very difficult things, and then we all see God's hand in our lives, and it enriches us so much when we, go through something difficult and see God move, carrying you through, and then coming out the other side and seeing. But it's very difficult. It's human nature to not be able to look up until we get down. It's just a funny reality. But I've seen so many times, as we're going through it, how he's carrying you through it. And I don't know if, is there anything that's taught in your foundation about knowing you're being carried through those difficult times?
Absolutely. I mean, that's precisely, you really expressed it so aptly that it's not like at those times we're walking ourselves, but that God is carrying us. And I think unequivocally that's the realization that we need to come to, particularly at those moments when we realize we don't have the strength to go on our own.
I just had a comment from one of those people watching, and she says there is no redemption story with nothing to redeem. So there's got to be a need
Of course,
for
right.
redemption. So yeah, to go through these things in order to be pulled out of it, and then that increases our faith and it blesses us, and we just know there's a God. It confirms it.
And again, and that realization as expressed in Isaiah chapter 12, verse 2, behold, the God of my salvation, I will trust and will not be afraid. You can't get to that level of trust without experiencing the travail and the realization that God was with me at my weakest moment, in my darkest hour.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay. Ron, you always want us to know if somebody asks you, you'll say something. So I'm going to ask you, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Well, I always enjoy your teaching, Rabbi. The whole issue of Passover as a suffering is very profound to me, and it makes me think somewhat of the birthing process. Of course, I'm not a woman, but every woman I've ever spoken with who's given birth to a child talks about the severity of the process of the birthing, and then almost immediately afterward talks about the surpassing exhilaration of the consequence of the process. When she holds that baby in her arms, she forgets the suffering for the superlative joy of the baby. And so I think this whole thing of suffering and exhilaration is remarkably illustrated in the Passover, as well as in the consequence of the Passover ritual itself, especially whenever the children of Israel go through the Red Sea. And there's another, it's almost like a birthing canal, leaving the old world of Egypt behind and emerging on the other side of the waters of baptism through the Red Sea under the brand new life in God. I have a feeling, I've heard in your voice today almost a semi-resignation. Your voice, you're always up and you're always pithy, but I've kind of heard a soft, um, it's hard to put a right word on it. Resignation is close. But I think that you're embodying to me, um, Lord, help me to say this just right. It's a good thing. Oh, okay. Well, I'll just abandon what I was trying to say and simply say, I think that you, and by you, I not only mean you in particular, but the Jewish people in Israel, and maybe even throughout the world, are going to experience a brand new sense of self after all of this. And I mean, in a contemporary sense, a brand new sense of self as a people right here in the world, because there has been, and God be willing, there will be an absolute destruction of a certain spiritual enemy that has opposed you for a long, long time as a consequence of this. That's my desire and my prayer. So I've enjoyed your teaching today, and I love you, my brother. And that's about all I have to say.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just want to, if I can just expand on what you just said.
Okay.
First of all, I have to tell you, much as often we listen to the radio, I see the news, things aren't, to put it mildly, always to our liking. One thing over the course of the last couple of years, but especially the last couple of months, everyone, politicians, newscasters, who really don't show any, if you will, any external trappings of being with God. Like every other sentence is with God's help. Thank God. And it's not putting on airs. You can see the authenticity. This is something that's and including with all of the positive and negative aspects of our prime minister, Netanyahu also. I don't recall him speaking all the time about God the way he's been doing lately.
Yeah, I agree with that. Did you happen to notice that there was a recent video op of a whole bunch of Christian prayer people surrounding Donald Trump in the Oval Office and praying over him, and him having his head bowed in very great humility?
I heard about this. I didn't see the picture, but I heard about this.
I just happened upon it on television, and I was utterly moved by it. And I think probably Prime Minister Netanyahu has probably experienced something similar. I think that there is a spiritual aspect of this war that is very visible. Oh goodness, I'm feeling a welling up of an intercessory spirit just as I'm talking about it. But may the Lord be pleased to hear our petitions. Our petitions are very strong. They're very deeply rooted. And I myself, Ron Barkley, have had such deep experiences in prayer since 2020 concerning all of these things. And now I'm actually seeing in graphic detail God doing many of the things I pled with him to do. I'm not saying God's doing this because of me. I'm one of many voices, including your voice, praying to God, crying out urgently, fervently, with a brokenness down deep inside. And I see him responding to us. And for that, I'm extremely glad.
I completely resonate with what you're saying. If I may just append one additional observation, you speak about the process of birth. And I must give credit where credit is due. This was an insight that was shared with me by a woman who teaches Torah. That and I hope this is going to ruffle too many feathers, because this does fly in the face of a real classic, namely the Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston.
Uh-oh.
But when
Oh,
we
now
read,
be careful. Don't go messing with us.
I know, don't you're right, but
Oh
still,
my.
this one point that needs to be stressed, and that is when we read in Exodus chapter 12, with respect to the Paschal offering, in verse 22, take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin and touch with it the lintel and the two side posts with the blood that is in the basin. Of course, in the Ten Commandments, that was famously on the outside of the door. In our tradition, it was inside the door. It was on the inside, not the outside.
Yes, I recall.
That is,
It's very
sorry?
Yes, I recall that now that you reiterated. I recall
Right,
that.
that is it is a sign for you, but not a sign for anyone on the outside.
Wow.
Obviously, from God's perspective, it doesn't matter when you put it on the outside of the door or the inside of the door. but if we ask ourselves, so what was the significance of this sign of a bloody doorway that everyone leaving home in the Exodus experienced what it was like to go through the birth canal, a passage that is full of blood.
That's beautiful. Oh, that's beautiful.
And full of blood also, not merely because of the graphic gore, but full of blood because how much blood was shed on the way there.
Wow.
But you emerge from this bloodied passageway into a new life.
Beautiful.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you very much, buddy.
Go ahead,
Thank
Clint.
you.
What you got to say?
Hi, Rabbi. It's good to
Good to see you
again.
again.
The newlywed.
Ah, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Mazal
Last
Tov.
January 10, South Africa.
Sorry,
In South Africa. I got married in South Africa.
but you're back in
January
Jerusalem
10th.
now.
Yes, I came up on February 2nd. No, I appreciate your conversations, the Passover, and particularly about the trials, and what wanted to the thought between the soul, the fish, and the spirit. And the trials that you're referring to, I equate that with my soul goes through that mind, will, emotions, my feeling. That's where the trials happen. My spirit is totally at peace with the Father. And the flesh, ignore the flesh because it's hostile. It's at enmity toward the Holy Spirit. And your teaching was very keen with the trials that go on in the flesh. Once you separate the flesh and the flesh from what's going on in the spirit. I really appreciate your teachings.
I appreciate what you're saying. I must say, we don't see it in terms of an antagonism. Ultimately, all those components are me. Every morning, one of our morning blessings begins with the words, "My God, the soul that you put in me is pure." Not was pure, not could be pure, should be pure, would be pure, might be pure, is pure. Is pure because the soul is the God bondedness with which each and every human being is endowed. We each have that connectedness to God, and that's our soul. And of course, to that extent, yes, it is pure. But I'm a human being that has within myself, because that's the formulation that we use, I have this soul within me, and I have other things that are within me, and I don't know if I would express it again. I would refrain from expressing it in terms of antagonism, but rather express it in terms of a churning over. Where
yes, recognizing that takes place in the flesh, the soul.
It takes place in me. I'm all of those things. Everything is part of what I am, and of course, to that extent, I need to align myself with that God connectedness, which ultimately lifts me up. as opposed to my turning my back on it and pushing myself down. But that's part of this ongoing process. And of course, to that extent, I recognize the experiences that I'm having in terms of my whole self. You could describe it as a group experience. The group is within me. That is, everything that I am is going through this and processing it, and admittedly processing it in different ways, but it's all components of what makes me who I am. I am not myself if I'm not cognizant that I have that soul within me that is and will always be pure. And simultaneously, I'm also not myself if I don't recognize that part and parcel of the challenges of life is living in this physical world. And at some level, ultimately being summoned to redeem that physicality as well. I don't shun it. I need to find a way to integrate it as well, to bind it with my soul too. Because the physical isn't the enemy. The physical is just the substrate that needs to be raised up.
Amen.
So,
Thank you, Rabbi. Does anybody else have a comment? All right. Well, I tell you what, I really appreciate you, Rabbi, always, as
Thank you.
always. I thank you for taking your time, and I'm thankful there were no sirens while
right? Yeah, this is last time I was giving a Bible study. We had an interruption, but thank God this time, I guess.
Thank you.
The
Well,
merit of the Nathaniel Foundation.
oh, all right. Well, we had some favor. We appreciate
Yeah.
that. I just want to thank the Lord for you, and I pray that He gives you more wisdom that you can share with others. And I pray that He protects you as you lead so many in the knowledge of the Torah. And I just want you to know that we express our gratitude for you today, and pray that it will be a merit for you and us in heaven, what we've experienced today. So God bless you, Rabbi.
Thank
And
you.
thank
God bless you, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, Chag
Happy and
Sameach.
blessed Passover to all. And
Amen.
thank you to all of you for joining. And of course, Paul, I hope you're still there, but I really want to thank you very much for joining, because I know it's not always possible for you, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to share with you folks. It's really a blessing for me.
Well, we have streamed it to YouTube, so it's archived there. And anytime you want to go back and listen to it. Hey, Paul.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, God bless you all. You have a great
Thank you.
evening, Chaim, and the rest of
Thank
us
you.
have a great day.